got to be exactly mirrored in the severity of the bust. And he said, and it doesn't happen that way. Ergo, Austrian business cycle theory is wrong. It was one of the few times when I told him that I thought he was all that. There's obviously no necessary relationship. Every boom has sick and good aspects to it. Every expansion is difficult to measure in any case, and there's no necessary symmetry. And that clearly is not a way to set up Austrian business cycle theory and just prove it and discredit it, but he believed that. Austrians, the second difference, Austrians want to replace the Federal Reserve with a free market in money and banking. Chicagoans want to reform the Fed, and if you again examine the writings of Milton Friedman, you'll see how much he equivocated on this point. I think it was really, in his case, just that he felt much more comfortable dealing with more conventional politics. And it's a little scary to have to be that radical to actually propose a free market in banking and money, when in fact, if you are a true Austrian, you would say, as I would, that I would trade a free market in international trade for a free market in money and banking. It's the worst thing for the government to be in, because when it controls the money supply, when it controls banking, as indeed has been true for centuries, then it's not answerable to the people. It can raise money, it can fight it, it can finance its welfare welfare state by printing money. That's the reason why the government wants to control money and lull the bankers into being part of that conspiracy. So that's indeed the most essential thing that has to happen as far as libertarians are concerned, for money and banking to be in the free market and not under the control of government. So those are two differences. I should also add, of course, the third difference is that the Chicagoans still are very prone to wanting to put everything in math. It's a long story, but I could show you many, many cases in which amazing myopia can be manifested about economics when everything has to be put in math. The Austrians teach that all the laws of economics, and they aren't numerous, they're relatively few, but all the laws of economics can be understood through induction about human behavior in markets. Next. Which again is to the point, what's wrong with the economic coverage in the New York Times? Well, 50% is mainly wrong, minus 50% mainly right equals zero. Why does it equal zero? Only because of this. If someone told me that the science section of the Times was wrong half the time, but right half the time, I'd have to quit reading it because I wouldn't know which half was which. I wouldn't know what I was reading, whether what I'm reading is accurate or inaccurate. I can read the New York Times because I spend 10 hours a day covering economics. I can read it sometimes with profit, and I can screen out the articles that I know are ridiculous. But it's much harder for anyone to do if you don't spend your entire day tracking economics. And so if it nets out to zero, then unfortunately it's not time well spent. Next. Let me go back then to my topic. This was all by way of preface. The meltdown of 2008, 2009, market failure or government failure. And I'm going to begin with a couple of bogus villains. Next. Well, two things that have been mentioned. Maybe they've been discredited in your mind, but I'll review them briefly. One of them that's been mentioned is, of course, securitization. Securitization was simply that mortgages, instead of being held by the mortgage originator, were sold to others in the secondary market, were packaged as securities. And that's fairly standard. And of course, the argument there is that when that happened, the mortgage originator was no longer bearing the risk. It was passing the risk on to others. And that is supposedly the basic problem. That was evil, passing on this risk to others, and they didn't stand by and take the risk themselves. To some great extent, of course, there has been vast securitization in the mortgage market. But if securitization was the problem, rather than just a symptom, then it should have brought down the credit card market. Securitization is ubiquitous in the credit card market as well. And indeed, you could broaden the point and say that any security that shifts risk, like a futures contract, that takes the risk away from the farmer or takes the risk away from the middleman, that's what futures contract, that too is an evil. But of course, it's really like shooting the messenger. It's just that if the underlying product has problems, then the derivative from which it comes will, of course, have problems as well. Now, the second is deregulation, another commonly heard complaint. Next with the deregulation, I'm listing there the fact that indeed there has been deregulation. Now, there are those who want to refute the deregulation argument by saying that, well, look at all the increases in rules. The government, this is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the economy. All that is true, but there was deregulation, and it took three forms. One of them was the elimination, it says 1990, it should have said 1980, the elimination of Regulation Q. Now, that meant that there was a ceiling, for those of you too young to remember, there was a ceiling on the interest rate that savings banks could pay. That put them in a real bind when inflation hit, and so the ceiling was lifted. They could pay whatever interest rate they want. Now, clearly, that form of deregulation, which is very important, couldn't have had anything to do with the meltdown. The next form of deregulation was the elimination of restrictions on branch banking. You may be amazed to know that it was very difficult for banks to establish branches, for them to be more diversified in that sense. And it wasn't actually until 1994 that the Reagan-Neal Act was passed that completely lifted, and essentially completely lifted all limits on branching, on going national with your banks. And that, of course, was also an enormous benefit. It meant that particular banks, there were many problems with those rules in the past. Obviously, if a bank has no other branches and it only specializes in one particular corner of a market geographically, then it's going to be much more vulnerable to risk. And that was also progress. The other was the Glass-Steagall restriction. How many times have I heard the lifting of Glass-Steagall? Well, that brought down the system. Well, the Glass-Steagall restriction was really mainly the underwriting of corporate securities, which was forbidden to banks. That never made any sense. It was based on the false doctrine that when an institution underwrites corporate securities, it's taking on enormous risk, when actually it's almost the reverse. We wish those banks and others had done more of such underwriting rather than taking on subprimes. It's a relatively low-risk activity. You underwrite the securities and then you market them. You're basically a middleman. And so that was what Glass-Steagall was all about. And in fact, that form of deregulation ended up stabilizing the system because it made it possible for Merrill Lynch to be acquired by Bank of America, for J.P. Chase, to buy Bear Stearns, for Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to become bank holding companies. So in fact, the three major parts of deregulation either have nothing to do with the situation or actually helped. So we can dispose of the bogus villains next, and we can get to the main villains, Fannie, Freddie, and the Fed. We'll start with the Federal Reserve, then we'll get to the to Fannie and Freddie, otherwise known as, it's terrible, of course, that these evil empires